Order, and welcome to today's session of the Transport Select Committee. Today we begin our pre-legislative scrutiny of the draft Rail Reform Bill. Before we get going, could I invite our witnesses, just for our records, to state your name and position, please.
I'm John Larkinson. I'm Chief Executive of the Office of Rail and Road.
Hi there, I'm Stephanie Tobyn. I'm the Director for Strategy, Policy and Reform at ORR.
Thank you. We're very grateful to both of you for giving us your time and evidence this morning. If I can start off by asking on a fairly general level, in your written evidence to us, you said that this bill could enable the IRB to deliver on the government's objectives, but the detail will follow later, and whether it is able to do so is not something that effectively can be judged at this stage. Do you think it's a right general approach for this bill to be quite narrow and tightly drawn and leave the detail until later, or do you think more should be on the face of the bill at this point?
Our overall approach in this is that, we don't give an opinion in the sense of on government policy. Government policy is government policy. We're the independent regulator, and the question is how do we help give effect to government policy, and also how do we, in the context of that, stick to our current duties and functions and things. So, what we really meant by that is that this is sort of one piece in the jigsaw, in a sense, but you then look at all the other pieces of the jigsaw, such as the overall funding arrangements. How would the passenger operations be run within Great British Railways? What would be the governance arrangements? So it was more that point we were making. So I think you could do it in different ways, but whichever way you do it, you need to see it in the context of all the missing pieces and what would be in those. Because, so for example, you have on the face of the bill the reference to the integrated rail body having an access policy. But in terms of knowing, well, what would be the impact of that access policy on, say, passengers and freight? Well, you only really know that when you see what's in the access policy. So it was more in that context.
Okay. Stephanie, do you have anything to add?
Just to emphasise, we do look at it as enabling, so it's enabling the key aspects of track and train to be brought together. But it's exactly that point, there's quite a lot more to be done in the detail till we fully understand it.
Sure. No, I understand that, as you say, this is one piece of a broader jigsaw. One common theme in all the evidence we received, or pretty much all the evidence we received, was that the industry needs this to get on with reform. And we don't have the luxury of waiting around until every last point of detail is resolved. Do you share that general view of urgency for getting this legislation in place?
We certainly respond to it in the sense that when we see this bill, we ask ourselves, right, what would we have to do now to help deliver on the intent of the bill? The bill is about integration. It's about bringing track, train together for some parts of the network. And the question is, well, what does that mean for us? What would the LRR have to do? So I think it's really important that each organisation thinks, what does that mean for us? And if you look at the government's consultation document on the rail legislation, it basically says there will be an independent economic and safety regulator, the LRR, and its job will be to provide effectively a whole system oversight and assurance around Great British Railways, or the integrated rail body. So effectively that sends a message to us that we will have a slightly different job to do here. We will have a more whole sector, whole system job to do. And therefore, in terms of, right, if this is the imperative, if this is what needs to be done, we would need to make sure we were ready to do that job. We had the capabilities to do that job, and we could set out what our role would be and exactly how we would do it. Because that would be another piece in the jigsaw, to an extent. So, seeing this as an imperative, the government sees this as an imperative, therefore there's an imperative on us to know how we would respond, what we would do. And we've done quite a bit of work on that to try and give effect to that. So I think the government is saying there's a sense of urgency around this, and therefore it's incumbent on the different parts of the jigsaw to respond.
So just to build on from that, and the draft bill makes provision for the licensing of the IRB, and the department is still in the process of drafting that. Do you have any role, formal or informal, in helping to shape that licence? And if not, should you?
Well, all the way through this rail reform process, one of our key roles has been to provide independent, impartial advice to the government, and we've done that to the best of our abilities. So we've had to have conversations about the content of the licence, and Stephanie's been involved in some of those conversations. So it is there as an advice role, and we will continue to do that. And so, indeed, in the government statement on the legislation, one of the tasks given to the ARR is to provide advice to the government. We will continue to do that. And of course, we've got a strong interest on this, because ultimately we will be enforcing that licence. So in a sense, the licence needs to be fit for purpose for the integrated rail body, for users and everybody else, and for the government. And we need to make sure that we can enforce the licence, and we need to make sure we can connect it to other parts of the system. Yeah, so I think we will have a very close role in providing advice on this. So ultimately the licence is issued by the Secretary of State, and it will be the Secretary of State's licence. But yes, we would provide a lot of advice.
But you wouldn't want to have, on the face of the bill, a statutory role in the drafting of the initial licence or any subsequent revisions? Is it best kept as a more informal role?
I'm into on this, but I think following through the logic of this, the Secretary of State's setting up a new body. The Secretary of State is effectively the ultimate shareholder, the ultimate funder of this body, and therefore it seems reasonable to us that he will want to issue the licence of this body. But in drawing up the licence, he'll want to take advice, and then he'll want to consult on a draft licence, we think. And so there'll be a process to get to that licence. I think it's therefore, we would see ourselves advising in some of the early stages. We'd see there will be a debate about what's in the licence, and then there'll be a reaction to that debate. So we think there's quite a process to go through to actually get to that point where the licence is put in place. We don't think it's something that's just, it's a short job. It's going to be quite a big job, I think. But we can build on what we've already got in like Net Rail's licence. It will be a bit different. Is that fair?
Yeah, I see it's a very key piece of the regulatory framework. It would be quite difficult to get that finalised at this point, at the stage things are at. A lot of it comes down to policy decisions, because obviously you have to understand what you're trying to achieve to then be able to draft the licence appropriately. But as John said, we have had initial discussions, and we're very happy to provide additional support on that based on our existing knowledge. But what is also important is that the licence is there from day one of the integrated rail body effectively taking effect. So it's a very important piece of if we stick with that analogy of the jigsaw.
And one last question from me at the moment before I hand to colleagues. Is it too early to draw any conclusions about how the governance framework for the IRB will look like at this point? Or are there emerging patterns there?
I think there's aspects of the government framework which just aren't in the bill. I mean, which is saying there's a choice there about how much you put in the bill and how much you don't put in the bill. I mean, one key aspect of the governance framework is always the funding of the body, and so the government has been pretty clear that for the infrastructure part of the IRB, there will continue to be a periodic review in the same way we've recently done a periodic review of Network Rail. So the infrastructure side of the funding is settled in that way, but then you need to decide on the non-infrastructure side. You could use the current model of the spending review settlement to fund the non-infrastructure side. So I think the funding framework remains is something that has to be sorted out. There's then this sort of general governance in terms of the freedom of manoeuvre of the IRB, in terms of how much money it's, how it can use its money, how much freedom. So I think there's quite a lot of the governance side which still would just need to be filled in. And I think the other bit is that you can have a framework, you can have governance, you can have funding, but the ultimate purpose of having an IRB must be to do something different in policy terms. And so the real question is, well, what different policies would be pursued what is now. So you have the opportunity with the body to join things up better. Okay, then. So how would that joining up be done better? What interfaces would be removed? What particular policy choices would be different? And so I think there's funding, there's governance, and there's also policy. It's policy intent. And you can see that a little bit. You can see how difficult that it is in terms of the way I think the approach to the private sector probably has changed a bit during the course of the 5.5 years of the rail review debate. I think we've probably, and this probably just reflects a different views at the time in the government about how much role does the private sector have in the IRB. So if you look at the train operators, so are they sort of contractors in this system, or are they groups of people which sense have freedom to innovate and take risk, and that relies very much on the contractual framework, what sort of contracts you have. And to me, that sort of policy framework, and you could call it governance as well, but it's a policy framework, so I think they're some of the key bits.
Thank you. Gavin, if I could turn to you next.
Yeah, thanks very much. Chair, if I can turn to the powers of the Secretary of State. It's not particularly unusual these days in legislation in this place for Henry VIII powers to be inserted into bills, but in your submission you did have some concerns. I think the perhaps wider point is one of the purposes of the IRB is to remove some of the kind of day-to-day running, I'm going to say interference, but that's not the word I would choose, of the rail system by the department. You talk about potentially excessively changing objectives or blurring accountability. There needs to be clarity as to which bodies are accountable for making decisions. So how would you like to see these powers of direction modified in a final bill?
So it's perfectly reasonable for the Secretary of State to have sort of powers. I think it's what we were alluding to, not alluding to, what we were saying was it really depends how often you use them, on what scale, and the extent to which it does or does not cut across other parts of the governance framework. So, for example, from our perspective, if we're enforcing the licence is a document which has been fixed. If effectively the Secretary of State issues directions that to cut across that licence, that would create uncertainty in the system. So, from our perspective, it's the powers will be best used sparingly. I think they'd be best used with a high degree of consultation beforehand, and they need to be used in a way that ideally they don't cut across other parts of the architecture. I mean, effectively, a licence really needs to be enduring. You have a licence because it provides a point of certainty in the system, and also they just need to be used carefully that they don't cut across any safety responsibilities. And so it's really just how you use that power. I think we're focusing on.
And what discussions have you had with the department on that? And are you aware of any other concerns on the same issue from other parts of the rail network or system?
I think the department knows about our views. They've seen the response. So essentially, we've had those conversations with the department. I think, though, although then again, if you look at analogies, if you look at national highways, the Secretary of State has a similar power on national highways and has had it for the last 9 years, and that's never been used. So it's not inevitable that people come in and use this use these powers regularly. So, but I think that's our probably our key concern on the direction and guidance. And then there is just the secondary legislation point, which you also mentioned, because this comes back to, and I think you see some of this in some of the consultation responses, because you see people saying, well, hang on a minute, what exactly does that mean? Which bits might you change, and for what reason? And again, using that power to amend, and it just goes through the affirmative procedure, you really do need to have a process which is very open and transparent about what's being changed, why it's been changed, the opportunity, as I think you allude to for people to debate that while they're doing it. Otherwise, you don't get some of the benefits of certainty that we could have in this system. So, yeah, that would be our views, I think, for sure. And
is your main concern in terms of, just to be clear, restricting the potentially restricting the autonomy and accountability of the IRB, or is it about the ORR's ability to regulate the IRB? What's the primary concern about these powers?
I think it would impact on both. I think if you're setting up an arm's length body to some extent, then you do slightly defeat the purpose of it if you step in on a regular basis. So I think that from a parochial perspective, you're absolutely right. I'm thinking very much about the ORR's role too. I'm thinking about our licence enforcement role. And I'm also thinking about the certainty of effectively allowing businesses to plan, because one of the advantages of the current settlement, where we have a periodic review, NetRail gets a 5-year funding settlement, there will continue to be a 5-year infrastructure settlement in this process. That gives some certainty to Network Rail. It's a long-term asset business. It gives some certainty to the supply chain. And you get benefits from that. You can achieve efficiency benefits from that. And so that stability of framework is I think, important. And I think also, so just add one more thing, if I may, on this, there is one useful distinction, I think, that's in the bill, is that the Secretary of State has the power to amend the licence, but we also have the power to go in and agree a change to the licence. And it seems to me that there's quite a lot of scope to make that work well, because licences do actually age over time. You can write a licence, the wording looks good, and then 5 years later the world's moved on. Even in a sort of technical amendment sense. And the Network Rail licence has been amended a bit over time. So it seems to me there's always sort of some small amendments that can be made to the licence for greater clarity. And that's something we could do, and that's something we would do transparently. The Secretary of State wouldn't have to get involved, and therefore effectively you reserve the Secretary of State for the occasional major policy intervention. I think that would be my summary.
And if I could, you mentioned being parochial. If I can be parochial for a second, Chair, and talk about Scotland. So obviously you're aware that the Scottish Government are primary funders of Scotland's railway, but the draft bill doesn't provide Scottish ministers with the power to issue any guidance or directions to the IRB, or even includes doesn't even include a requirement for the Transport Secretary of State to consult the Scottish Government before issuing directions or guidance. And again, staying away from the politics of all this, from a practical point of view, would it be better for rail delivery in Scotland? Because ultimately, the whole point of the IRB is to copy many of what we've tried to do in Scotland with Scotland's railway, etc., etc. But there may be the kind of unintended consequence, an integration, maybe slight disintegration in Scotland. But would it be better to have some power for Scottish ministers to issue guidance or directions to the IRB within the bill?
I think I'd probably classify that as a government policy issue. But can I make a connected point though? Because from the way we see it, I think, and Stephanie's our director for Scotland, so I'll ask Stephanie to come in a minute. The way we see it is that the IRB covers a part of the rail network. So Scotland train operators will currently be outside the IRB. And I think the Scottish Government's response is fairly, they've turned down the offer of being the franchisers in the IRB. So if you think you've got a group of people inside the IRB and a group of people outside, so the Scottish train operator will be outside, the freight operators are outside, open access, High Speed 1, Eurotunnel, Cardiff Valley Lines, etc. So from a regulatory perspective, it is the classic issue of effectively you've got a sort of almost like an insider group, an outsider group, whatever you want to call it, and therefore that boundary of ensuring fair play, in layperson's terms, of ensuring fair play, from our perspective, a regulator becomes quite important, because all rail legislation stays in place. Rail legislation stays in place. Competition powers stay in place. All the sort of things that we do around, say, authorisations of trains or rolling stock, all the decisions that might need to be made on who actually gets access to the track if there's an argument, those sort of powers stay with us. And hence, making sure it's fair for the people who are outside IRB, as well as fair for the people inside IRB, I would see as a crucial thing that we would need to do. And I think that's why we're part of this, important part of this framework. And therefore, if there was an issue, and so from our perspective, say, holding the IRB to account, well, if we look at Scotland, effectively we need the operations and the infrastructure to continue to work together in Scotland. If we thought the infrastructure part of the IRB wasn't doing its job properly in Scotland, we would follow a similar process to now. We would have a process of looking at the plans of the infrastructure as part of the IRB in Scotland. We'd have a process of making sure those plans are fit for purpose. And indeed, in the recent Network Rail plans for Scotland, we came back and said that the freight delivery plan is not good enough. And to be fair, Network Rail said, yeah, okay, fair point, we agree. So we would continue to step in those areas, we'd continue to monitor, we'd continue to report transparently about Scotland, and we will continue to have enforcement powers around that. From our perspective, we will continue to do that job.
I don't know if you were going to come in.
Yes,
but just, I suppose, quickly, if I can just add a layer to that, just to, in terms of, might the draft bill as it is make the infrastructure provider more distant and less accountable to its main funder in Scotland than the current kind of arrangements with Network Rail Scotland?
I think that goes back to what John was saying, is that the fundamental principles are very much the same. There isn't a huge amount changing. The Scottish Government can still specify what it wants from the infrastructure. It can still set the funding for the infrastructure. We still have a role there in ensuring that level playing field. And as you've already alluded to, they've brought track and train together under ScotRail Holdings. But it just presents a slightly different, if you like, perspective for us to be thinking about, well, they will be outside the IRB, so we do need to think about how those things operate in future. But very much all the framework is exactly the same. And I don't think we can really get involved in whether or not directions are appropriate.
But our last question from you, Chair, in the discussions with the government on the draft bill, was this particular issue discussed in terms of how that's going to work with Scotland essentially being outside the IRB, in terms of how any changes to the current setup or etc. etc. Was it discussed at all with the regulator?
I don't think we would have been part of the discussions with the Scottish Government around that.
The main change is
with the DFT.
Sorry,
with the DFT rather than the Scottish Government is my point, given that they're the ones bringing forward the legislation.
I'm not. Correct me if I'm wrong, Steph. I don't think we've had any detailed discussions with the Department for Transport. But what we have done is, going back to a sense, what's on us to resolve, that we're clear that if this went ahead as a process, we would need to set out how we would hold the system to account as a whole. We would need to do that specifically for Scotland too. So we need to say what is different now in terms of what we need to do. So I think I can only approach it from our perspective, really, about our role. And the fact is that the rest of the underpinning legislation has not changed.
Okay, I think I mean to continue this discussion offline with regard to competing ambitions, but in other areas as well.
Thank you, Gavin. Before I pass to Paul, I just want to ask a supplementary on your point about there needing to be transparency in how the Secretary of State would use his powers, Henry VIII powers. One of the rationales for this piece of legislation is to end the micromanaging of the industry from the department and let the industry get on with innovating and developing and so on. Any politician, any minister will come under pressure at times to intervene. So what would that transparency process look like? So it's perfectly proper for ministers who are ultimately responsible to have that backstop power. But what would the transparency process look like to ensure that it was only used in exceptional circumstances or strategic points rather than meddling, if I can use it that way?
You're absolutely right. I mean, there's clearly this huge political pressure, isn't there, at any point in time to do something in that sense. So I think a lot of that is around giving assurance to the Secretary of State. So if you just take the way some of the processes work now, overall, the Secretary of State has the power to approve Network Rail's delivery plan for a control period. Now, that could drag the Secretary of State really deep into the detail. You could imagine a future world where the Secretary of State might think, well, there's an easy way to intervene about this one, I could change the licence or something. But in practice, if you set up a structure around that, which gives assurance to the Secretary of State that it has been scrutinised, and here it's been compared to, say, to his overall strategic specification, and here's the only areas where, say, we think there are any material discrepancies, you sort of start narrowing it down, and you provide assurance to the Secretary of State that this has been checked, has been considered. And if, for example, you look at some of the consultation responses, where I think quite a few of the regional bodies have said, how would LRR take into account the role of regional organisations in scrutinising the business plan? And this is something the Secretary of State was particularly concerned about. You can build that into the framework. You can effectively say, here's the assurance to the Secretary of State that this has been done, here's how it was done. So I think some of this is around giving support to the Secretary of State to allow him or her to say, right, OK, I sought assurance, I've got assurance, I don't need to get involved here. Otherwise, as you said, there must always be a slight temptation to feel that you need to do something.
But does there need to be something on the face of the bill that sets out what that transparency process looks like, or does that again follow later in the detail?
I think it's just a political choice, really. And I think it's quite difficult for us in terms of political choices around the bill. So I take it a slightly different question about if that's the if the aim is to try and make sure the Secretary of State doesn't need to intervene in detail and it's not in the bill. What sort of process would we have to describe? Because we would have to set a lot of this out. What sort of process would we have to describe that would give assurance such that effectively the Secretary of State didn't? So I think I'm approaching it from that perspective rather than sort of directive, which I don't think we have really the role to do.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. Paul, if you could turn to you next.
The latter part of the answers there has largely gone into the area that I was going to come at you with, which is regard to your role in terms of scrutinising the IRB's business plan. You know, and I think if you could just develop that thought a little bit further in terms of, you know, you can talk about scrutiny of a plan after a plan's been created, or should you be involved in that? Should you be involved in that, or should you actually be involved in the determination of what that plan's framework should look like in the first place?
So our working assumption now, and again we would need to set this out, our working assumption now is that we would get involved a few, as you suggest, a few steps back, because the real, based on many years of experience of working with this on Network Rail, you really need to be clear on what you're expecting to see on the business plan. You need to be clear on what data you're expecting to see, what questions you're expecting to see answered, and actually that makes it a lot easier for the body. It makes it a lot easier for the IRB. Otherwise, it's almost a bit like, you know, caught you out type game, which really isn't anyone's interest. And also, that specification of what needs to be in the business plan allows the IRB to come up with a draft. But then, going back to the transparency point, you really want people to understand this business plan and be brought into it. So you really want the IRB talking to people about what's going to be in the business plan, effectively socialising the business plan. So when you get to it, organisations like the regional bodies or the supply chain have had a chance to have a bit of a say in it. So it is a matter of, it sounds slightly bureaucratic, but it is a matter of setting up a process to come up with a business plan that ultimately will be published. And the crucial thing about the business plan is it then forms the basis of what you can hold the company to account for. But it's been through a fairly robust process to get to that point. And also, effectively, we've had our chance to say, and I think this goes back to the question, one of the questions that Mr. Newlands was talking about, that gives us an opportunity to say, actually, you haven't really covered, say, Scotland in sufficient detail in this business plan. You know, we need to see more about this. And so eventually you end up with something which hopefully covers the basis.
It goes back, I think, a little bit to what you were saying at the start about the different pieces that all need to be pulled together.
Yes.
Sorry, Stephanie, you were obviously going to say something there.
I just wanted to add, I mean, we do see the business plan as absolutely key, along with the licence in our whole sector oversight role and how we then go on to hold to account. So it is something that we would be using to monitor and to assure that the IRB was delivering what we expected. So it is, exactly as you were just about to come on to, a fundamental piece of this jigsaw, but it is not there yet. And the process is in detail, obviously, is not there yet around how that would work. But we expect a licence condition to deal specifically with the business plan.
Okay, and just going back to the usual point on this, does that need to be on the face of the bill? Does the business plan responsibility?
There is a section on the bill about the business plan, but it is more that there will be a business plan. Again, it comes back to how detailed you want to make the bill, because it then does tie you into certain decisions, or is it again an enabling piece of legislation, which is how we see it at present, for further detail to be developed.
And I think it could work like that, because effectively there will be nothing stopping us issuing effectively a public notice saying this is what we should believe should be in the business plan. And so if anyone disagreed with it, they could come and say, "Well, hang on a minute, that's not good enough." So, and I think it does go back to that transparency point. It's the transparency that is absolutely crucial to this, because it will be an absolutely enormous organisation. If you think Netrail has got not far short of 40,000 staff, just Network Rail, you're spending more than 10 billion a year, and then you're adding a whole group of train operators to this, you're creating an absolutely massive organisation, and you can decide on its regional structure, you can decide on its operating structure, but in terms of the overall public accountability, if someone's sitting, well, we've had a lot of conversations with the Treasury around this, from the Treasury's perspective, this is a massive expenditure area, and a massive accountability area, and therefore the whole thing needs to be pretty rigorous and transparent.
Just to probe a little bit further, you used the phrase a couple of times there about the regional structure versus the we all get the desire to have the guiding mind over everything. Does that guiding mind come up from the regions or down from the top?
To the best of my knowledge, I don't think there's been any decision taken on what you might call the operating model within the integrated rail bodies. So the way the conversations have gone is that effectively each organisation needs to have a target operating model of some form. You know, what is the structure of these organisations? What are their policies, and how do they all fit together? And you can envisage different operating models for the way that the integrated rail body works. I'm not aware that there's been any policy decision on how that would work if the legislation was to be introduced. But from our perspective, to some extent, we would have to reflect that in how we're going to work. I mean, if there's a very strong regional structure or a less strong regional structure, we would have to work on that basis. So we'd need to make sure our operating model fitted in with that operating model. So the conversations we've had with the Treasury, because from a parochial perspective, our funding level is set directly by the Treasury. And so the sort of questions the Treasury have asked us is, okay, if the IRB is going to look like this, what will you need to look like? What are there areas where you would need to build capability in order to deliver your role, and how would you do that? So I think this will reverberate across the system. You know, depending on exactly what the IRB does, we would have to react, and we would need to show we had the capability to respond to whatever that structure is. As far as I know, that hasn't been not been any statement around that.
Okay. Anything to add to that, Steph? No. Thank you, Chair.
Before I pass to Jack, I just want to ask one quick question. Do you have any concerns about the removal of your ability to refer matters to the Competition and Markets Authority in cases where the licence is modified without consultation?
I don't actually see that as a big issue. Really, it's a sort of fairly remote power in some ways. And again, trying to follow through the logic of the government policy intent here, you've got the Secretary of State, who effectively owns the company, is going to issue the licence. And in some ways, I can see it from a sort of government perspective. It might strike strange if then it could go off to somebody else, almost to second guess the Secretary of State. So I think from my perspective, the issues are more the sort of the conversation we were having earlier about exactly how does the Secretary of State use some of his other powers around directions and guidance. For me, that's probably a bigger issue than the CMA point.
Okay, thank you. Jack, I could turn to you now.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to ask you a bit more about some of the competition issues, and particularly the OR's competition duty. And you've raised concerns, obviously, about potential changes around this. Could you outline what those concerns are and how you think it will impact on your work?
Yes. So So I think we've got to ask ourselves, what's the policy intent of changing the competition duty? So, and this is, so just be absolutely clear in terms of sort of, sorry, it sounds a bit technical, but this is not about sort of our broader competition powers about whether we can investigate the signalling market or, as we're currently doing, investigate the rail catering market. This is not about this. This is about one of our duties. And the duties are the things that we have to apply in making decisions. And one of the decisions we have to make is around competing access applications or around any access application, for example, particularly on open access. So my understanding of the intent of this change is to just try to tilt the balance a little bit to make it a bit harder to approve open access. Not a dramatic change, but slightly harder, almost like give the OR a bit more pause for thought on approving open access by referring to the impact on public funds. And so when we said we were concerned, government can have government policy, and that's not for us to choose. But if you look about how we make decisions on access, and I've made many decisions on access, it tends to follow a fairly sort of clear path. So if you read our decisions letters, we're quite clear which duties we have drawn upon to make a decision. Normally, we look at the benefits of passengers. An open access operator wants to run maybe to a city that's not served by direct London services. That's benefit to passengers. We look at the impact on public funds, because if the open access operator is taking money away from an existing franchise, that could have a hit to the Secretary of State. We look at impact on performance and capacity and things like that. So in that sense, we already look at the impact on public funds on the Secretary of State. We already do that. And so the reason why we said we're just a bit concerned about this is we see it as a bit of a duplication of something we already think we do. But we appreciate and understand that it's designed to sort of send a clearer message around effectively how much weight to place on a particular issue. But in practice, we see that happening anywhere. The Secretary of State could write to us during any access application and give a view. And indeed, throughout my whole time in the ORR, until very recently, each time on an open access application, we tend to receive a letter from the Secretary of State saying, please do not approve this application because it's going to cost the government money, which is a very perfectly reasonable government position. So it's not as if we're not very clear on what the government of the day thinks, because recently the government of the day, the mood has shifted, I think, more towards more pro-open access. And again, not surprisingly, government policy changes over time. So it's more the issue that it's a duplication. And that's why we're just saying it just seems to make it slightly more complex when we feel we're already required to do that.
The government is very keen on more open access. So,
yes.
What really should be done to promote that and encourage that?
Well, ultimately, open access is a market decision. I mean, in a sense, we don't go out trying to get more open access onto the network. It's a market decision for whether people want to make an application. We've taken part in a government and treasury initiative on what are the barriers to open access, and indeed we've had a session with our Stephanie Minch to talk a bit about that. So I think some of the potential barriers to open access are well known, but from our perspective as a decision maker, we have to apply our legal duties in making it, in a sense, an impartial decision in that case, and sometimes we've turned down open access requests and sometimes we've approved them. But do you want to say more about the barriers?
So we have worked to try and understand what potential open access operators feel about the process. We have looked at whether or not things could be more transparent. For example, capacity could be more documented differently, if you like, by Network Rail, so that a potential applicant could look and assess more quickly where they could potentially fill gaps. We've looked at our own particular process. We've looked at how we work with DFT. So, we're trying to take a sort of whole picture look here. Let's just check what we're doing. Is it working? Do people have concerns about it? And are there tweaks we could make? And just going back to this particular point, we are very transparent about when we make decisions, what duties we look at in particular, what evidence we have gathered, and what we think the impact will be on government funds. So It is this slight confusion we've got.
Is the consideration also about, though, what private investment might be attracted into the sector? Because obviously if we've got a private company coming to run a whole load of open access services, that's potentially going to result in a significant enhancement to the rolling stock, to the fleet, things like that. Is that a consideration or not?
We certainly look at potential barriers. What would be the barriers to investment? And one of the things, in fact, Stephanie's team are just literally doing now is, it goes back to the transparency point, is we're going to put a dashboard on our website about how the access process works. Because one of the questions that was raised is, can people actually see how things are progressing? Who's holding this up? Whose fault is it that things are taking a long time, including the regulators?
So it might cost a slight amount to Treasury, but it might result in a huge amount more of investment gains.
Yes, and one of the so we've currently got a sort of mini consultation now, which has come out of the conversations with the Treasury and government about whether we need to make any changes to the way we assess access applications, and whether we need to take a broader look at benefits from access applications. And we've got a sort of mini consultation out there. It is an issue. So at the moment, for the first time ever, we have the prospect of two competing bids to compete against Eurostar. We've never been in that position where there have been people actually engaged in serious discussions about major investments, because if you want to compete against Eurostar, you need some new trains. Trains go through the tunnel, have to meet particular safety requirements. It's a major investment, and that is a radical shift. So we're currently in quite detailed conversation with a major investment group about what assurances do they need from the regulator, or what do they need to know from the regulator, in order to allow them to proceed to an application. So we do very much sort of think about that private investment.
I just wanted to ask you a bit more about that, creating that certainty for those companies to invest, and particularly when it comes to freight. And you'll probably be aware, I've asked some questions of the OR about freight licences and the changes of those, which obviously were previously 10 years, now I think it's gone to 5 years. Do you not see that as a retrograde step, really, that we're going from a 10-year licence that, I get it was given on an exception, but we're going from a 10-year licence for those freight operators now to a 5-year licence? Is that not a retrograde step?
So the base case for all licences, unless there's substantial investment or other circumstances, is 5. So the question is, what in legislation? So that's not an ORI decision, that's legislation. What more? The question is, what more do you need to do to agree a 10? Because a 10, by definition, is taking up capacity for quite a long period of time. And you're right, there has been a debate about that. There's no doubt about that. There's been debate about that with the freight companies. And one of the things we said we would do is look at that whole basis around the way the decisions are made about the length of licence. I'll let Stephanie come in a minute, because I know she's been involved in more in this. But so we do really understand this idea about certainty, encouraging investment. But we also have to take into account the fact that the legislation is quite clear about what you can and can't include. Now, just talking about the sort of the wider bill here and changing legislation, potentially other bits of legislation, I mean, in theory, there's a potential opportunity there. So I'm going to let Stephanie come in on that.
So as John said, the 5 years point is for the track access contract, and that is set out in the legislation. We've certainly had discussions and looked at longer term contracts, so it's not impossible that we can do that, and we have set out the criteria we would look to be able to approve a longer term contract. So it's not quite as black and white as it might sound, and certainly we have had discussions with stakeholders on that.
So what sort of things are you looking for? Is it about investment, or is it
it is more about certainty and
Right.
business plans and reasons why it justifies a longer term contract, as you might expect. You would expect the plans to be there in place, what people want to do, what sort of investment they have in place. So it's not unusual to ask these sorts of questions, but certainly I'm not seeing that impacted by what we're talking about on the bill at this point in time, but others might have views on that.
I think there's also, just going back to the overall certainty for freight, it does come back a little bit, I think, to this interface with the integrated rail body. And I think you can see in some of the responses from the freight groups about from my mind, this is the classic sort of big guy, little guy type situation in terms of a regulatory setting. You've got a very large organisation with potentially a lot of power, they're going to publish a document called an access document. Well, what's going to be in that document? Is it going to have a sense of different priorities? This is about allocation of capacity. The point of it must be about the allocation of capacity, must be about timetables. That's, I think, what was set out in some of the government's documents about it. So if you're a freight company looking now, I think you'll be thinking, well, what's actually going to be in these sort of documents? And that's where...
Are you suggesting there could be a risk that freight gets squeezed out, basically?
Well, I think I don't know what's going to be in it, because I don't, as far as I know, there isn't a draft of such a document, so I don't know what the IRB priority will be. But if generally speaking, in all industries, if you're the little guy in the industry, you look to see at all these things and think, hang on a minute, is there a prospect of being squeezed? On the other hand, as you can see on the face of the bill, there's a licence provisions going in around freight, so that's a sort of supporting measure there. But from our perspective, the fact is that the rail legislation stays the same. The ultimate access decisions are ours. They have to be made transparently. They have to be made in accordance with the law. And so I think in terms of providing almost like the backstop certainty, I would have thought that would help the freight industry.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Great.
Thanks, Chair. I wonder if I might just try and clarify some of these issues about access and so on, and the role of the ORR under the new framework, that's set out in the draft bill. But can I just try and get something clear on my own mind first? Your responsibilities currently relate in particular to access and safety. I mean, you mentioned it spans infrastructure and network. I wanted to ask about, do you have any role in assessing accountability of the operators? You know, you said how important the business plan is a key element of the bill. But in terms of performance assessment, you know, the current national rail contracts, do you have any role in that? So and there's nothing envisaged in the new structure either.
So currently, the franchising and hence government contracts, or national rail contracts, or the future contracts which are set out, the PSCs, these are directly between government and the industry. We don't have any role with them. We do try and do things as far as possible in a sort of whole system sense. So when we look at Network Rail's business plan, Network Rail talk to train operating companies about performance forecasts, about, well, okay, what's the overall performance going to be? And we certainly join in those discussions. We try and work wherever we can in a whole industry context. We try and work out the contribution of the train operators, Network Rail, but we don't have any role in either designing those contracts or monitoring those contracts. But that would change a bit under the new structure, because if we've got accountability for the whole of the IRB, the integrated rail body, then and it would depend very much on how this is structured with the passenger train. I don't see us getting involved in the detail of contract negotiations, but in terms of is the passenger operation arm delivering what it's supposed to do within the IRB, then I would see that as part of the overall monitoring of public reporting and accountability framework. So not so much the detail of the contracts and things, but
so there's an element of performance assessment in that.
Yes. Is this what are these companies committed to do? Are they delivering it? Yes or no? I would see us having a role in that. Yes, because otherwise we couldn't do the whole system oversight and assurance in sort of independent way.
I want to ask about access and but I just want to ask a little more about that. Is the data readily available currently as presently presented by the train operating companies for you to make a reasonable objective comparison of performance so that you can hold them to account?
So certainly at this moment in time we wouldn't have access to that sort of data in any detail. Because we're not part of the system, we just wouldn't have access to that data. We have found, I mean, there's no doubt that there have been some issues. So if we look at Network Rail's performance forecast, Network Rail had difficulty agreeing performance forecasts with the train operators, partly because they're on different sort of contractual lengths. The train operators work very much on annual business plans. Network Rail worked to a 5-year plan. And so it was quite difficult to align performance forecasts. So we've looked at those things, but no, at the moment we do not have access to that sort of information.
Okay. Thanks. I'll pursue that with the second panel. But just on this particular point, because when we are formulating our response as a committee to the draft bill, we're very interested in your view, particularly in relation to some of the new provisions. And the draft bill includes a new duty for the Office of Road and Rail to have due regard to the Integrated Rail Board's access policy statement. Now, is there a danger that the Integrated Rail Board is going to be able to trump your ACE or in relation to access under this new framework?
So you chip in if you want to add on this, or you think I've got something wrong. So when we first had a discussion with the department about this and with GBRTT, and it was clear that there was an intent to have this access policy. Our view was very much, well, if that's what you want to do and that's going to signal policy intent, then it's a very sensible idea to ask us to have regard to it, because otherwise you're not following through the logic of you're trying to change something, you want the regulator to look at it. So that's fine. We certainly don't have any issues with that. Obviously, at the moment, this is a little bit in the abstract, because since that document's not been published, it's hard to say exactly how we'd react. But
Mr. Larkinson, you were being very diplomatic, if I may say so. So in your
I'm
view...
going to have a final answer to your question. Sorry, I was going to answer your question specifically. You asked effectively, does it, to use your language, trump my ace, sort of type thing. So ultimately, with this bill in place, the role of the ORR to have the ultimate approval of access decisions remains, because the underlying legislation has not changed.
Okay.
But
so even though you must consult and pay regard to IR, you will still, your understanding is you will still retain that.
Yes, but we would then have to show we have had regard to that access policy. Is that a fair summary?
That's absolutely it. And if you look at it from other stakeholders' perspectives, setting out how people will be able to access and use the network can only be a good thing. If that's very transparent. It should aid, consistency, predictability about how the IRB will work, and we would expect certain principles to be in there, sort of fairness, transparency, non-discrimination. So the tool itself, in a way, is a good way to hold the IRB to account, because they would be setting out, this is how we're going to work. But as John said, it doesn't trump, if you like, that ultimate power.
And it's part of your assessment to do with performance as well, and that might relate to freight access, and might relate to the performance of the operating companies in terms of reliability, cost, and so on and so on. Would that be an element in your consideration as to whether a recommendation should be made on access?
We do look at performance, and we do look at capacity on the network now, and I don't think that would change at all in this new process. But
do you think is your opinion that you don't think it should change?
Well, I think those are the absolute key points you should think about in any access decision.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah,
That's important that we know your view. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Need to move on to our second panel in a moment. And we've covered quite a lot of ground this morning. But are there any other points that you would like to make about the bill, or areas that you would advise us to focus on during our scrutiny?
No, I think we've covered the ground. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Order, and welcome to our second panel of witnesses for our session today. Again, if I could, for our records, if I could ask each of you just to state your name and position, please. I'll start with Mr. Bagnall.
Andy Bagnall, I'm the Chief Executive of Rail Partners.
Steve Montgomery, I'm the Managing Director of First Group's Rail Division.
Maggie Simpson, I'm the Director General of the Rail Freight Group.
Jacqueline Starr, I'm the Chief Executive of Rail Delivery Group.
Welcome all, and again, we're very grateful for you giving us your time and experience this morning. If we could begin by asking each of you the same general question that I put to the first panel, and that is, this draft bill is deliberately very narrowly defined, and a lot of the structure and work and objectives of the IRB will come later. Is that the right approach to get momentum, or are there other general areas you would like to see on the face of the bill before it becomes legislation? I can just work down the line. Start with you, Andy.
I think actually you've heard quite a good simile for this from the first panel of saying that the bill is sort of one piece of a jigsaw. It has been described to me by the department as keyhole surgery on the existing legislative framework. So you obviously need to think about the bill in the context of the 1993 Act, the 2005 Act, but also some bits of the jigsaw that we're yet to see. So the licence, the exact nature of the new contractual model, and so on. So there are certain aspects, and I'm sure we'll pick these up as we sort of work through your questions. There are some things where we think it would help to have certainly greater clarity alongside the bill in order to answer some of the obvious questions that the bill throws up. So the licence, the access and use policy that you just heard John Larkinson talking about, and some areas where we do think sort of tightening something up in the bill itself would actually be helpful for providing some of that clarity.
Thank you.
Yeah, without repeating a lot of the stuff, again, similar views that we have to ensure that the bill, when it would come into legislation, has got a lot of this stuff sorted out. There's a lot of uncertainty in certain areas with it, where we welcome, the guiding mind type concept. We need to make sure that it's given the freedom to be able to help regulate, working with ORR and helping regulate the industry and making sure that it's got a proper strategy around it. And again, as we've talked about before, taking that day-to-day ownership away from government, from DFT, and allowing this body to act independently as much as it can to deliver the railway back to where we want to take it back to, delivering for the customer.
Thank you. Maggie.
Yeah, I mean, there's uncertainty out there for my members at the moment, not only through rail reform, but, the fallout of HS2, East Coast, other areas. And actually it is a concern about the level of uncertainty that businesses are being asked to operate under. The draft bill is a step forward, and that is a good thing, but before it is enacted, I believe we do need to see more about some of those other areas. The licence is obviously critical, the access and use policy, the structure of how GBR, at least in headline levels, will be put together, and how it will work for different parts, freight in my case, and others as well. So it's great that we're going through the scrutiny of the bill, but before it's enacted, I think we need to see a lot more to build confidence.
Thank you.
So having a draft bill is a good thing, and we're very supportive of the guiding mind. I think there are three key areas, majoring on the first that I'll cite in knowledge that our members, train operators, are focused on customer outcomes, and that's making sure that customers, our people and industry are appropriately reflected in the bill, to make sure that we have checks and balances to ensure that we're clear on the changes that we're advocating on behalf of those three groups, but predominantly the customer group. I think the other consideration is, you heard in the first panel, in terms of you're bringing a number of organisations together potentially. It will be vast in size, and a check and balance, again, potentially around the customer, is just to ensure that some of those interfaces that currently exist will be improved as a result of that.
Thank you. Now, the proposal is that Network Rail Infrastructure Limited will be the corporate entity, the legal entity that will become the IRB. that in itself I don't think is controversial, but where there is considerable concern is that if this is the vehicle, then the IRB doesn't become a Network Rail 2.0 and just import its existing culture. It has to be a new body. Is that a fair summary of your position? And if it is, how can this bill, or maybe perhaps the bill isn't the right place, how you may not be able to legislate for culture change, but how do we make sure that the IRB's culture is very different from that of Network Rail? Please.
So in our written submission to the committee, I think that is one of the big questions about the draft legislation. How do we end up with the introduction of Great British Railways creating a system which is ultimately outward looking, focused on the passenger, and not what some would describe as a sort of engineering-led railway or inward-looking? And I think the sort of the problem statement of that is, how do you make sure the customer comes first rather than thinking about the maintenance of assets, whether that's about sort of repairs and maintenance and how that picks on the customer, or the degree of risk aversion that we approach to extreme weather events that we're increasingly seeing. So that's the sort of the key question. How do you ensure that happens if you're building the new structure out of the sort of the Network Rail kind of engineering base? You've just said, Chair, culture is very hard to legislate. I'm not sure the bill is the place where you can put in place some of those safeguards. We've already talked about some of the other pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, and for us, one of those pieces is actually really important to ensuring that the system as a whole is outward looking, and that's the contractual model. So we think the operator, which is the part of the system closest to the customer, is very well placed to act as the grit in the oyster, a bit of a sort of check and balance internally within GBR to keep the focus externally and ensure that it isn't ultimately engineering led. So that's, if you like, another piece of the jigsaw. In terms of the sort of the bill specifically and some of the measures, though, we've called for there to be a duty on Great British Railways put into the licence, and ideally we'd like to see that on the face of the bill alongside some of the other duties, but recognise why that might not be the case. But at the least we'd like to see it in the licence, a duty alongside the one to promote freight growth, to also promote passenger growth and a growing railway. And again, that could help focus the system as a whole, GBR and its contracted operators focusing externally. Another area is the performance regime. So the bill allows for the performance regime, those operators contracted by Great British Railways to be exempt from it. We would like to know what would put in place to ensure there are incentives on performance before you sort of enacted that exemption. And then lastly, and you've had a lot of this in the first session, regulatory oversight by the OOR we think is absolutely critical, again, to ensuring that the organisation, as you describe it, doesn't become Network Rail 2.0, isn't sort of looking exclusively from the infrastructure perspective. Rather, it's looking outwards and doing what we need the railway to do, which is deliver for passengers and freight customers.
Thank you. Steve?
I think it's critical that, you know, whatever the body is set up has that independence, and it's not a Network Rail Infrastructure Limited. I think a lot of that will go round about how they choose to populate that organisation. If it's done a little bit like GBRTT, where a number of people have been taken out of Network Rail for obvious reasons, we understand the reasons, you know, we need to make sure that that independence there to give confidence to the private sectors in particular, you know, for myself as First Group, where we run a lot of open access operations. It's vital that we have that confidence that this group, this body, can make sure that it's not going to be run by because there's only X amount of pass and Network Rail don't want to run more trains on it. So how do we make sure that that doesn't get caught into, you know, the body, caught into where this body is placed, and it doesn't have the influence of Network Rail fully over it. So really important who they appoint to the roles, how we get that independence into it, and what guidance it's given to operate.
I mean, I think that, you know, there's a contradiction at the heart of the model in a way, which is that if you integrate the track and some but not all of the passenger trains into one body, then that body is going to care most about its own passenger trains, and and if it doesn't, arguably it's failed. So to use John's analogy from earlier, if you're inside, tick, get it right. If you're outside, it's a bit of a question mark, and that that is the contradiction that we've been worrying about since the beginning. And Keith Williams understood that in his plan for rail, and that's why measures like the freight growth target, a central freight team, these things are put in to try and help counteract that concern that this organisation will favour its own trains. So what we're constantly looking for are the areas where that risk could materialise and the protections that are being put in place to close that off. And when you think about what an organisation might look like in the future, obviously there'll be good people at the heart of it, and perhaps the worst won't happen. But you do have to think, well, what could happen if it wasn't today's people, today's government, today's Secretary of State, today's head of the whatever. Where are those risks going to materialise? And I think you'll see in our response there are areas where we think those risks remain unacceptable.
Again, we'll be exploring some of these as the session goes on. Jacqueline.
So culture is clearly a really important aspect, and if the IRB is made up of a number of different organisations, then one positive component is that they are very possibly, and I offer RDG as an example of this, inheriting very good, healthy, positive cultures that we've invested a lot of effort in. So whilst it's probably not appropriate to legislate against culture, I do think it's worth serious consideration around the mechanisms that we can put in place to ensure that we have a healthy improvement and we have a formal way of assessing that. Part of that culture, and Steve alluded to this, is around diversity in the sector. So for me, the IRB creates a huge opportunity for the sector. This is a new opportunity to have a fresh workforce, build on all the skills and expertise that we currently have within the industry, but also making ourselves attractive to expertise outside of the industry and bringing in an appropriate blend of in-house skills and commercial expertise, and having a very blended workforce, which looks slightly different from what we have now, attracting people of colour into the industry more than we have now, attracting more women into the industry, and really grappling with this opportunity that the IRB presents to be diverse and creating a workforce that can look to the future. Some of the issues that we're talking about today aren't necessarily the issues that the IRB will need to grapple with in 2, 3, 4, 10 years. Climate change, for example, some of the technology innovations, and so we need to have skills and capability equipped to influencing that in the future.
Okay, thank you. But before I pass to Jack, just to clarify, none of you have any objections per se, notwithstanding the concerns you've just outlined about the Network Rail Infrastructure Limited being that corporate vehicle? Or is there some other body that you think should take that role?
Sorry, I'll come back on that. I think we would recognise the need to move forward quickly. Reform is delayed. The sector needs to push ahead, and NRAIL, for a variety of practical reasons, offers the best chance of moving forward quickly for some of the reasons the government sets out in the consultation response around the practicality of moving 40,000 people and so on. So I think we would recognise that need for speed, but do have those concerns around safeguards. Sure. So without the right safeguards, there is an ongoing concern.
I think if you were not doing it at speed, then you would not do it this way.
Right. Yeah, easier to build a new culture and a new organisation than to change the culture of an existing one.
And I think we're still very unclear on the structure. So does it look like Network Rail's structure today with some passenger trains shoved into it? Or is there a plan to change that structure, particularly around what a guiding mind is or isn't? I spent some years at the SRA. That, I think, is a different sort of guiding mind to what's being envisioned here, but it isn't wholly clear.
I would support the views that Andy and Steve have presented.
Okay, thank you very much. Jack.
Thanks, Chair. And sort of what I'm going to ask follows on a bit from what the Chair was asking, and is about whether the IRB is going to be sort of sufficiently independent and not be as we've been talking about Network Rail Mark II, would also not be completely controlled by the department. So do you feel that it will be sufficiently independent, or is there a risk that actually we'll just see continual interference as we've seen at the moment. Do you want to start, Andy?
I think there is a definite risk of that, Jack. I think there's a consensus from what I've seen across all of the parties, actually. I've seen Mark Harper as the Secretary of State and Louise Hay as the Shadow Secretary of State talk about the need to have an arm's length body and limit the degree of sort of micromanagement from the department. But there is still, I think, quite a big question of how long is the arm in the arm's length body, and there are a number of aspects of the bill that sort of cause concern with that. I should say, as a sort of way of giving context, though, I don't think you can ever fully remove politics and the quite proper role of politicians from the running of the railway. There will always be a huge amount of public money going in, and it's right and proper that elected representatives determine that and what they need the railway to do in terms of wider outcomes for the country. So that's the context. But then, after determining those things, it's important to allow sort of railway experts to get on with running the railway on a day-to-day basis. And the bill gives the Secretary of State a very large amount of power in terms of sort of setting the licence. They'll still set the high-level output specification and statement of funds available. They'll sign off a long-term strategy. So the Secretary of State, I think, has those powers. Where I think there are concerns, it got mentioned in the earlier session, and I imagine we may come back to this, but the Henry VIII powers in the bill recognise a degree of need for those in the setup, but certainly think there is less of an argument for ongoing powers to make consequential provision. So we would like to see those limited in time after they're used for the initial setup. Similarly, there's a question around exempting the Secretary of State from being a shadow director. And I think that there are already protections for the Secretary of State for Transport to avoid being designated as such. I think the question is begged if you need to put a provision in the bill to limit the possibility of the Secretary of State being designated as a shadow director. It does suggest that there is a greater likelihood that you're protecting against that will be the case. And I think that creates a slightly unhealthy potential blurring of accountabilities. But probably the most important thing in the bill is the question around directions and guidance, which leaves a very, very large and ongoing power for intervention. And again, you touched on this as the committee in the earlier session. Inevitably, there will be political pressure, politics being what it is, on the Secretary of State to intervene. So we think, while you might limit the Henry VIII powers in time, the ability of the Secretary of State to issue directions and guidance should be limited in scope. Whether that's through a sort of set of criteria that would be published alongside, or whether it be on the face of the bill, I think is a different question. But certainly finding ways that you can limit intervention to those strategic issues, which is right and proper for the Secretary of State to be involved with, and create a degree of certainty in terms of the day-to-day running of the railway at other times.
Dissenting views?
I don't think there's any dissenting views. I think we have to look at where we currently are at this moment in time, and we understand why coming out of the pandemic and the degree of control that was put over the industry, and particularly in the passenger service elements of it. But if we're going to move forward, and everybody agrees we have to move forward, if we just create another layer of bureaucracy there that doesn't allow this independent body to move forward and it set the new agenda for the rail industry. We understand the need for the Secretary of State to lay down the strategy, but we also need this IRB to be able to then deliver it without a lot of interference, or we'll just move, as we do sometimes, of, well, we don't quite like how that's going, we're going to change it again, we don't give anything a chance. So if we're going to regrow the railway in the way that we all want to, then we need to give this body an opportunity to be able to deliver without interference.
I think from my point of view, what my members want is stability and certainty, particularly around access, particularly around charges. And actually, the framework that gets envisioned leaves the Secretary of State with the abilities, as you would say, to micromanage, but also, the IRB, huge amounts of powers to change things, not least by actually phoning the Secretary of State up and asking if they could use their executive powers to change something. So it isn't necessarily that we've got a benevolent IRB and a nasty government. It could be all sorts of versions of that theme. Yeah. So what we need is stability, and things like the powers to amend, which are indefinite, take that away. And so we're nervous about those because you've got lots and lots and lots of places here where that stability can be removed in different versions. The other thing is about the governance, and I think the previous panel talked a bit about their role in that governance, but there's also a relationship still between DFT, and the IRB, that governance needs to be understood so that there's more clarity than we have about how the IRB will be governed overall.
Jacqueline, I wanted to particularly ask you about, obviously you mentioned, and the previous panel mentioned about the fact that this is going to be a huge organisation and lots of staff, and really couldn't this become a bit unwieldy as an organisation? Isn't there a risk that this becomes far too overbearing and that we suppress the potential of innovation and competition within the rail sector?
It's a risk, but with the appropriate check and balance and scrutiny, I believe that could be mitigated or removed. Hence my offering at the start around the primary components of customer, people and industry, and making sure that we've got clear line of sight to the outcomes that we're driving in those areas. And a good example of that, to bring it to life, is on the topic of intervention from the Secretary of State. Things change. You can have the cleanest policy, the best strategy, the most beautiful delivery plans, but things change. And to date, we have seen examples of where the Secretary of State has stepped in to change perhaps minutiae of products. That shouldn't be the question. The question is, how do the outcomes for our consumers of these products and services, our customers, how do they need to differ as a result of that? And how are we organised as a huge organisation, 50,000 plus people, how are we going to organise ourselves to make sure that we can stay on track in terms of that delivery and not lose sight of why we're here and what's important? Those are the important aspects. And yes, that's going to be really difficult to navigate for an organisation that size. So the scrutiny that's in place to ensure that we have that line of sight around outcomes is going to be really important.
Steve, is First particularly concerned about, competition and what the effects are going to be on this? Because, if you've got an organisation of that size, really, is there room for innovation?
I think our big concern is that we have that independence and that there is innovation allowed to grow out of this. The fear is that this body is solely focused on the delivering for government, if I can say it that, and where does the private sector fit into that area? They've been able to help deliver and innovate, which it's proven to do over previous times and growing the industry through the years. So how do we make sure we don't lose that element of it, but have that greater control and if I can say, the less scrutiny? As part of this independent body that's set up is meant to have less, allow the sector to start to do a lot of things again, start to innovate again. We need to remove the micromanagement. That's the biggest concern. That's why everybody's supportive of the new body, but we need to remove the micromanagement. But we also need those protections.
Well, we don't
that's
want
why
to just move the micromanagement from one location to the other, do we really?
Well, exactly, that's why it's so important that the ORR are not, the powers are not diluted in any way, because again, as we've talked about freight, open access operators, other people outside of that main body, if they don't have that protection, then how do you get investment into the industry? How do you bring people to it and create new jobs and have different thinking, different ideas? So that's really important for us.
Any other thoughts on that, how we make sure that there is proper competition and we don't have this micromanagement?
You may be coming to this in later questions, so I don't want to preempt, but something we touched on earlier, that need to have the contractual model as part of the jigsaw to understand the way in which the system as a whole would function. Ensuring, if you like, sort of decentralisation doesn't just happen from Secretary of State to the arm's length body, the IRB, but then also happens from the IRB with its contracted operators to allow the system as a whole to be focusing outwards on what freight customers and passengers are doing. The passenger service contract is a crucial component of that, and the way that's configured. At the moment, the national rail contracts, Steve sort of alluded to this, are very, very restrictive, and that was absolutely right for the emergency of the pandemic, the way they were introduced, but we now need a very rapid evolution of those. Ultimately, they're bridging contracts to the long-term passenger service contracts. We need those passenger service contracts to be developed, but then move towards competing for them as quickly as possible, and ensuring that they have the right spectrum of contracts to again deliver that ability for the operator to be outward looking and respond to the customer. So they might be slightly more controlled in urban areas, but actually on long distance routes you need a lot more commercial freedom to drive really good outcomes for passengers.
perhaps answered the part on innovation. So just to add to that, an example is if you think about supply chain and also the third-party retailers through which Rail Delivery Group manage, current practice often dictates the thing or the change that we want them to react to as organisations and suppliers, as opposed to, again, talking to them about the outcome or the point that we want to get to. And that's stifling in itself, which is why I bring us back to, from a strategic level, we need to have a clear oversight of customer outcomes that have the freedom to encourage that innovation from supply chain and retailers, which isn't just about the new shiny stuff, but it's some of the local improvements which cater for the markets that operators are supporting.
Thank you. Thank you.
Paul.
Thank you, Chair. Just a warning, can we start this end of the panel? We've started at that end every time so far, so I'll come to you first, Jacqueline, if that's okay. And what I want to do is go back into a subject that I touched on in the first panel, which is about the actual business plan itself. Really interested in your views as to whether there should be more detail on the face of the bill about what the IRB's business plan is. And that could be anything. It could be about the time it should cover. It should be about how it should be scrutinised, etc. But your views around that, please, if I could ask you. And also about the fact that on the bills there's a provision for the IRB to amend its business plan. Anybody that's worked in business, particularly in the private sector, knows that certainty of framework is a good place to start on anything. So the ability to flex that change is also something I'd like your views on, please.
You welcome appropriate levels of scrutiny around the business plan with appropriate levels of independence, and we need to ensure that appropriately represents the views of our customers. So we should have customer data to hand to reflect that, but also that we're calling in on the voices of wider industry, supply chain, but also tech innovation companies potentially outside of the sector to really provide something that's comprehensive and relevant for the industry. I think in terms of the tenure, the duration of the business plan, it's important for us to be as strategic as we feel we can be. We've referred to 5 years. I think that's a good starting point. We're not wedded to 5 per se, but I think it's certainly a longer term horizon than we currently have. From a supply chain perspective, they're crying out for us to offer a definitive plan that underpins a very targeted strategy which allows them to invest, gives them the level of stability for a whole raft of reasons, not just about being able to invest to deliver the right services within the industry, but also back to their people part so they can attract the right people. So actually we have the right level of expertise kind of growing the markets.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I support that. It's important that there is one. It's important that it's part of that governance framework. For us, obviously, it's key that those plans don't only focus on their own services, but on how they encourage freight and indeed, presumably other operators as well, so that the two come together in one document respecting those roles in effect. And that's the really critical part for us. Because obviously the IRB isn't going to be running the freight trains, but it is nonetheless going to be providing the network on which the freight sector will play its trade in effect.
No, I think not to put words in your mouth, but I think we've got to be very, very careful that it doesn't become an and freight discussion.
Absolutely.
Freight has to be an integral part of it.
It's absolutely got to be at the core of how the IRB is set up, and we need that governance to reach out to, however it's structured, those routes, regions, business units, whatever they're called, that they're all incentivised to do the right thing for all the operators on their network.
And just before I move along, just on the specifics of the the representations we've had from the Rail Freight Group and things, in terms of any particular concerns about that structure when things are coming from the regions up as opposed to the national down. Do you want to just give us any views you've got specifically on that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as Jacqueline, as I said, it's a big organisation. It's going to have some sort of regional structure. What we don't understand is how that works together for operators who are, national, and so that if you are, a big customer of rail freight, you're going all over the country with your trains. You'll have terminals and depots all over the country. You need a consistent product. You need fair and equal charging. You need access and capacity that provides you that network that isn't broken at borders. and you need to understand how that's going to be managed at a system level, and we are sort of far from clear as to how that structure will be set up in future.
Okay, thank you. John? Steve, sorry.
I think the big challenge here is how do you get the scrutiny over the business plan, you know, and the inputs from it. There needs to be wide consultation. Our fear is that it's almost a fait accompli, you know, and if we don't get that input from the outset, and the reason why I say that is, particularly in private sector world, if we understand what's in the plans, you then plan round that and how you stay within the industry, how do you think you can help grow the industry and put those inputs. And if you don't have that plan laid out in a way where there is sensible inputs into it and consultation for everybody, then you start to look other places and you say, well, you know, has this got a future for us? So we've got to make sure we don't lose that innovation. Again, the big fear is that we make it bland, just it's just contracts and there's no real inputs required from outside of it, you know, and that's the biggest fear I have is for private sector land. How do we make sure that there's something there that's attractive and we can make that happen and grow the industry and be part of it?
No, I think I spent 40 years in the manufacturing industry, so I understand, you know, what you're talking about there. But it does seem to me as though there's a desire or a need for there to be a certainty of their business plans as well in the medium term, so that you know what your business plans can be that fit into a framework that isn't about to change in 12 months' time or something.
Yeah. It's a bit an investment strategy you put aside. You know, if you've got capital within your business, where are you going to invest in? You have to start planning that years out, as you know. So how do we start to invest in it? And how does it give the supply chain, the private companies, how does it give that comfort that there is a future there? Yes, the passenger service contracts, you have to bid for them, but likewise, at least you know that they're going to be there and you've got an opportunity to make some inroads into that.
Okay, thank you. Andy?
Trying to avoid repeating what's been said. We support the idea of a 5-year business plan. Exactly. We support the idea of a 5-year business plan. I think it's quite important it's across track and train in the same way that Great British Railways would have that sort of wider remit. There's obviously the 5-year infrastructure funding settlement at the moment, but 1-year annual business planning rounds for train operators, and we've seen that is sort of very inhibiting in terms of getting optimal outcomes from train operators. So making sure that business plan covers both is important. The point you're making around certainty, I think, is absolutely right. You've got to get the right balance between certainty, as Steve said, so that organisations can invest against that, at the same time not setting things in stone so it can't be changed. John Larkinson touched on this in the earlier session, which is about having, therefore, a transparent process, clear role for the OR to monitor implementation of the business plan and oversee a sort of change process. In terms of then, should this be on the face of the bill, we think it would be helpful to have the requirement for that 5-year plan on the face of the bill. It sort of locks that in, but having it clearly in the licence would be a good second.
Okay, thank you. And just one, you mentioned yourself there, you know, the track and railway combination, if you like. The removal of the need to keep separate accounts for these, does that impact in the real world? No, yes. I'll come to this end again. I'll go back. So the fact that the IRB is no longer required to keep separate accounts for both track and the railway operation, does that impact it yourselves in any particular way? It could be a yes or no from each of your panellists. It doesn't. I don't need to.
I think that the position from ourselves on that would be, as long as it's not to the detriment of investment more in one area versus the other, so more infrastructure, less customer, for example, that would be our key consideration.
Okay, Maggie?
Yeah, I mean, so freight track access, all track access charges are set on the basis of costs directly incurred, so if you don't understand what the track costs are, you can't bill fairly. So, it would be a matter for the regulator, I think, to make sure that non-GBR operators weren't being unfairly disadvantaged by the merging of those cost lines.
Okay.
Yeah, I can understand, bringing the P&L together, but likewise, in terms of, what you don't want is an inefficient area over here with revenue growing over there that masks inefficiency, or in both sides, and it could go either way. So how do you make sure that you've got controls and balances on that to make sure that one part of the area becomes, as I say, less productive than another part of the industry?
Yeah, and it should just come down to the way the, to use the term, the management account of the operation is set, as opposed to maybe it's the ones that they publish out, but you need to be able to do that control separation of information that can then be used for decisions. Sorry, I need to finish.
No, I think if your question is referring to that change to, I think it's 14.9 and 19.4, so that allows that sort of bringing together of accounting for track and train. I think that's good. Steve touched on this. We support the idea of a single P&L, and think that's one of the ways, in terms of the earlier question, you avoid Network Rail 2.0 by giving sort of skin in the game across cost and revenue across both track and train. So I think that's good. But, and Maggie touched on this earlier, there is a danger in doing that. The reason they're separated at the moment is to create a sort of level playing field for all operators on the railway. By bringing together, you're going to have Great British Railways and some Great British Railways contracted operators. But for open access operators and for freight operators, John Larkinson used the phrase, you've got an insider-outsider relationship. And so it's absolutely clear there is a potential danger for conflict of interest between Great British Railways and Great British Railways contracted operators and other users of the railway infrastructure. So there does have to be, again, sort of stability, so people have got confidence to invest. The other thing I think is very relevant to this is the performance regime. Again, if you're going to exempt those sort of insider operators from the performance regime, that could reduce the overall incentives quite significantly for those that would still be subject to the performance regime. So even though there would be some incentive for GBR to deliver and meet its performance targets, the overall reduction, probably 70% of operators would be outside of the performance regime, would be quite a significant diminishment of the incentives on GBR to deliver.
Yeah, so can I just add a small point? There's a lot of talk about whole industry P&L, and it's a good thing. I understand why you'd want to do it, but lots of the industry is not in the whole industry P&L. So if you make life more expensive for people who make wagons or rolling stock or fences or terminals because you've improved the whole industry P&L for GBR's operators, it isn't a victory.
No, and I think we all know what's going on in terms of discussions on rolling stock at the moment. That we need to make sure that people know what's happening. And I think the point that seems to have gone right through this discussion is being transparency and the need to make sure that everybody's clear as to what's happening. Chair.
Thank you, Chair. And first to RDG, to Jacqueline. And in your submission, you particularly reference with regards to the requirement of the IRB to produce an annual report on private sector involvement, and you said that it would be far better for the Secretary of State to actually just hold the IRB to account for actually delivery of that. What would you like to expand a bit more on that? Because that is something that I think obviously there's a lot of interest in making sure that there is that effective private involvement and competition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the documentations and the proposals and through the consultation, there have been reference to the appropriate mix of private sector involvement and engagement, and there have been some statements and intent around innovation and continued growth. I think there needs to be appropriate scrutiny to ensure that we hold people to account to those statements, to make sure that we're utilising private operators, taking it back to enable them, quite frankly, to serve the communities and the demographics that they know best. So it doesn't need to be at a global level, it can be at a local level as well, but it's really important to have the mechanism for that scrutiny to be in place so that we can monitor that and tweak if necessary.
So you clearly think that obviously the idea of having this annual report is not really that effective. What alternatives would you suggest to create that sort of mechanism to better hold the sector to account for that competition?
Yeah, I mean, the reason we think an annual report is not necessarily the best thing for this particular aspect is because it's probably going to be quite reflective. It's going to look back at what's done and tell a story about that, as opposed to holding feet to the fire on a proactive, ongoing basis. So perhaps appropriate level of scrutiny through current parliamentary mechanisms to make sure that real time we are standing true to some of those commitments around the level of private sector involvement and what benefits we've realised through that, and to keep adjusting to make sure that we're driving optimal performance.
And in terms of, we've talked a bit about regions and where should this sit, and you mentioned there about that, you know, it might be better at a local level as well, not just at a global level at Secretary of State's level. So at the moment, obviously, Network Rail's regions are basically done for their convenience on signalling areas. They don't reflect at all economic geographies. I mean, my own city is split across two Network Rail regions, which is totally bizarre, really. Do you think more should be done to ensure that at a local level, you know, reflecting those economic geographies, that there can be better accountability to ensure that the rail network is better serving those towns and cities?
Yeah, absolutely. And possibly this language on my part, apologise for that. You know, really, perhaps communities is a more appropriate word than regions, given the context that it's used within Network Rail. But that's what I'm really talking about, is getting to the hearts of the communities and the demographics that operators are serving, you know, your constituencies, plus the global piece. So it's about that top and tail piece and the appropriate balance between the two.
Okay, moving on to rail partners and passenger service contracts. Obviously, they're not currently in the legislation. There's not a need for them in the legislation, but obviously operators need that certainty. So do you think more could be done to ensure that there's a better process to outline what they're going to actually look like?
So, yes, very much. I sort of don't want to repeat my answer of earlier, but very much they are part of those jigsaw pieces that make up the system as a whole. I think having...
Do you think they should be in the bill, though?
Well, I don't think... what's most important is the contractual model. So there was some market engagement that began to be conducted by the department around what the new contract would look like, sort of engaging with industry. In common with the broader reform agenda that's sort of been elongated, over the last couple of years, returning to that market engagement, developing those contracts, so understanding what they would look like is an important piece of the jigsaw. And I think there is an urgent need to move on from those national rail contracts. They are being evolved by the department, but we need to move quickly to the passenger service contract. And if I may, just a point on the private sector report, I would sort of agree with the point that on its own, a report, while it's a really welcome recognition of the role of the private sector and that it can play, it does need to be meaningful rather than just a sort of performative report. And so you do need KPIs in it. One of those could be actually delivery of that pipeline of passenger service contracts, just as an example. So I do think the contractual model is very, very important. If what you're asking about whether it should be on the face of the bill, of course, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, the department described this as keyhole surgery. So the requirement for the contracts still exists, but in the 93 Act rather than in this bill, if you see what I mean. So whether you would need to actually update and say they must take the form of these new passenger service contracts, I wouldn't see that as necessary. The role of the private sector being contracted to deliver train services is still there in the legislative framework. What we need is to know the detail of what that contract will look like going into a sort of,
so really
future model.
There just needs to be more openness about what they're going to end up looking like from the department, really.
Exactly. We need to understand what they look like. Again, I alluded to this earlier. You need a spectrum of contracts. We, rail partners, have previously called for sort of three different models. A concession, more tightly specified model that's probably right for more urban areas, but then moving to a long-distance model, which would have more commercial freedom for operators. So we need to understand the spectrum of those contracts through that market engagement process, and then very clearly have a timeline for when we'll return to competing them.
How far off do you think we are getting to that point? Because obviously there's quite a bit of work to be done to try and evolve what we currently have into something completely, different, really.
So if you look at the timetable that was in the original white paper, it suggested it would take 2 years from market engagement to develop the contract and get to the point of the first competitions. So that is a realistic estimate of how far away we are now. When we return to market engagement, it might be then 2 years before we see the first passenger contract let. What we need to see in the interim, if you like, to bridge that gap, is that further evolution of the existing national rail contracts to ensure they move, sort of evolve closer towards what we would like to see in passenger service contracts, which is greater freedom for the operator to drive revenue growth and obviously restore the industry's finances. And that can be done within the existing contractual model and is urgent.
Steve, have there been any engagement with First Group and operators like yourselves about what these should look like?
So there was early engagement on what these new passenger service contracts, but that all stalled as we ran through the various stages, and then obviously the various reports that was in, and particularly the Williams report, it never moved forward as the industry kind of waited in what was going to be the outcome, with GBR getting set up. So we never got further feedback on that elements of the passenger service contracts. But we did have input into it at that stage and made a number of recommendations to the DFT at that time.
So you would like to see more, or sort of restarting of that?
We need to restart the process again, because as Andy has alluded to, we're sitting in this hiatus at this moment in time, which is not good for the customer as far as we are concerned. We need to be able to move forward again and take away some of the micromanagement that we've spoken about.
Maggie, you particularly raised concerns about paragraph 8 of Schedule 2 concerning the freight industry and how the IRB may be able to run its own freight services. What are your specific concerns, and what would that mean for the industry?
So I think this is one of a huge number of things where a change gets made to facilitate the one thing that somebody is thinking about, and it has a consequence that doesn't get necessarily picked up. So, Network Rail is banned from running commercial freight trains in competition because that would, with private providers, it would be anti-competitive probably, wouldn't have to pay an access charge, government borrowing at preferential rates. So for my members, that would be a big concern. The purpose of that clause change is not, I don't believe, for the IRB. I don't think they're sitting there gung-ho, great, we can go and remove some containers. What they want to have is a law that allows them to run the passenger trains, but the consequence of changing it is that. And if you go across all the changes that there are lots of things you could change that will have a consequence, and they don't get picked up. We intervened on some work on depot licensing, which would have ended up with Great British Railways running the Port of Felixstowe had it gone through in the way that it had been proposed. So we need to be super scrupulous, particularly around things like the licence, the access and use policy, that we're not creating adverse or difficult scenarios for some parts of the sector.
I asked earlier, obviously, about the licences and whether it would be better to move to longer tenure or more. Is that sort of the view of the industry, that it would be better to have longer licences that would give more of that sort of certainty?
Yes, I think the two things that perennially worry my members are access rights and track access charges, and both of those are described in the access and management regulations. And the powers to amend that sit in Clause 8 of the draft bill give the Secretary of State a lifelong ability to change those regulations through secondary. And that it makes us really, really nervous because, if you look at situations like the fallout of HS2 or the East Coast timetable, where people do want to change the access rights that private businesses hold to deliver a different outcome, that is something that is a real worry. So if it makes it much easier for the IRB to change the access rights of private companies, that is a real concern. And that's our core nervousness about those powers to amend, is that then that risk sits indefinitely with the private sector in a way that it doesn't today.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Chair. I wonder if I might go to Andy Bagnall first. I just want to clarify a couple of things. Your organisation exclusively represents the private sector operators, is that correct?
Yes, so we speak for the owning group, so the parent companies of the train operators, the 5 biggest freight operators, all of whom in the private sector. We do, though, provide technical services across public and private train operators. But in terms of who I'm sitting here representing today, exclusively the private sector.
And, clearly from your website and from your evidence earlier, you're promoting greater involvement and development from the private sector of the network.
Yeah, so we've consistently called for an approach that's the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
So we've been strong supporters. We've been calling since our original submission to the Williams Review for a new public sector body, slightly counterintuitively as the private sector calling for that, but we do think there needs to be more coherence and joined up approach to the network as a whole, but within that, absolutely exploiting the commercial expertise, innovation, investment of the private sector as operators.
Okay, but that's interesting. I'm just thinking about what's happening at the moment and the reason why we have this bill, why we have this draft bill, and because of issues over fragmentation, private sector failure and so on. We've got 7 franchises that are being run in the public sector, 3 in the devolved nations and 4 in England. And that's where we've got the operator of last resort. And indeed, we had the operator of last resort, or their evidence, at the committee last year. And the rail minister at the time was actually full of praise, and he said, I'm not focusing on being dogmatic about one particular system or another. I'm focused on the performance and the turnaround. And it's interesting to note, every single one of the 4 operations, performance has gone up. And he said, I'm grateful for what they're doing. And yet when I was looking at your evidence, you said, it was going back in August 2022, we believe legislation should not contain new powers to issue direct awards to a public sector operator. We believe putting passenger service contracts, PSCs, out to competition to the private sector will always deliver better value for money, whatever the circumstances. Mm-hmm. Well, clearly that's not true, is it? Because we've had special sessions of the committee over Avanti's poor performance. The 7 franchises that are being run by the public sector, the operator of last resort, they've come about due to private sector failure. So why are you apparently afraid of competition from the public sector?
So there's a few points in there to respond to, if I may. So firstly, I think the private sector has, and you can point to the evidence, we set this out in a quite extensive report last year, delivered for passengers over time better than a public monopoly. So if you look at the British experience in the periods from privatisation to just before the pandemic, we saw a doubling of passenger numbers, services increased by a third, half as many people again working in the industry. So by any objective measure, this was a success story. Not saying that the system was perfect, but certainly that was the sort of the private sector delivering. We're also seeing across Europe increasing use of competition in terms of competition for both contracts but also open access operators, and we see that again here in the East Coast, which deliver good outcomes for passengers.
Okay. But Andy, can I just ask you about how we measure improved performance? And you mentioned the increase in passenger numbers, and I think there are a number of factors on the value for money cost and passenger satisfaction. And I don't know whether we measure those through passenger service contracts or national rail contracts. I'm not clear in my own mind if those two things are different. But I do think, in fact, you mentioned that the integrated rail board needs to have some key performance indicators by which they can make a judgment about performance. And I was a little perplexed when the panel were concerned that the Secretary of State shouldn't have powers to intervene over non-strategic decisions. Is poor performance not a strategic decision, a strategic criteria and a key performance indicator?
So look, I think it's really important, if we're going to get the right solutions from rail reform, that we diagnose the problems correctly. And if you look at the problems, the challenges the railway is facing, there's sometimes a trend to sort of exclusively put the blame on the sort of private sector operator. Actually, what we saw during the pandemic was, in effect, the industry move further into the public sector than it ever was under British Rail. We've talked already in this session around sort of micromanagement by the department in terms of the contractual model. We know that the pandemic had a huge impact on the finances of the railway. That in turn has partly driven the industrial action that we're seeing that impacts on performance. So when you put that together and you look at cancellations and delays across the network, actually it's only about 30% of them are the fault, if you like, attributed to the operator, and there are other factors that are driving some of those issues around performance. So we think the right thing to do is look at the sort of challenges the railway is facing, identify those correctly, try and address the weaknesses in the system, but also then carry through the strengths of the previous system into a reformed agenda. And that, if I could just finish that point, that's the point I was making around the private sector has a track record of delivering in Britain, doubling passenger numbers, turned an operational surplus, an operational deficit for the taxpayer, where the taxpayer was putting in nearly £1 billion a year at the point of privatisation, transformed that into then a surplus that was being paid into the Treasury, about £4 billion in total in the 10 years in the run-up to the pandemic. So when you sort of look at that, that's why we were arguing that the private sector has an absolutely key role to play in that reform system going forward, but under, of course, that Great British Railways governing mind.
Yeah, but your kind of contention there is that there isn't a role for the public sector, and my suggestion is that looking at performance, if we can reasonably compare performance, and I don't want you to hog this. And if you don't mind, I want to ask Steve Montgomery about how we can better compare performance and make an assessment, because I'm a bit concerned that we're not always comparing apples and apples. That, for example, Avanti West Coast taking up a lot of time of this committee and parliamentary time. They only published data for the last year. And if we're going to make a comparison about performance, surely it would be sensible if all the train operating companies published 2 years' data so we can see, is there an improvement, is there a trend. And bizarrely, West Midlands only published the absolute minimum, which I believe is 3 periods. Other train operating companies like East Midlands, Greater Anglia and Greater Western are more helpful. They publish 2 years' worth of data. And as I said, that does allow a comparison over each year. So couldn't we reasonably ask that the train operating companies produce this data in a standardised form so that it may support your argument, Andy Bagnall, that the private train operators are far better than the public sector operators of last resort. But it's very difficult for us to make an objective assessment of performance without data that's presented in a standard format. And I have a suspicion it's deliberately presented in different ways by different companies. And I would personally like a commitment from you gentlemen who are in a position to influence your members to provide that data in a form that we can understand.
So, you want me to answer some of that, Graham?
Yes.
Graham, the data is provided. The ORR also published data as well. They've just recently published data on cancellations that you may have seen for 23-24, which shows, I can't remember all the figures, Northern Trains, LNER, cross country, and then Avanti's cancellation numbers. So they are published as information there.
In a standardised format?
Yeah, well, ORR have a standardised format, they bring it out. Train operating companies put it on their website.
Yes, they do, but they're all different. They're all different. So Mr. Montgomery...
What part is it different? I'm sorry, I'm not quite clear, because under our NRCs, we're required to show certain metrics. So, right time, 0 to 3, 0 to 15, and cancellations. All cancellations talk on self-cancellations. That information is published on almost, I would be surprised if it's not on everybody's company's website.
Steve, could you take an action to get the information to Mr. Morris, do you think?
Yeah, well, of course I can.
Cancellations, I mean delays and so as well. Yeah.
Have you any other questions on
well,
the bill?
I just think assessment of performance is a key issue in terms of network access and extension of franchises and so on. And I don't know whether we have the information in a format that we can make that comparison reasonably. I'd be grateful if you could furnish it. Thank you.
Any other questions? Jack, you wanted a quick supplementary?
One, if I may, Chair. So we talked a lot about the private sector and particularly with regards to operators, but we haven't really talked about the infrastructure, and at the moment there's very little private investment going into the infrastructure in this country because of the reluctance and resistance that we see, particularly with Network Rail and some of the structures. So I particularly wanted to ask Andy what more could be done, because this isn't the case in other countries. Other countries we do see more private investment going into infrastructure as well. What more could be done to, and will this these proposals allow for more private investment to be attracted into the infrastructure that we need to see as well.
We certainly think that the private sector, in the same way as we were just discussing with Graham, the private sector can add value in train operations, drive better outcomes for the customer, and also drive efficiencies for the taxpayer. Clearly harnessing the private sector on the infrastructure side can again drive efficiencies and particularly sort of bring in innovations. One thing that I think has never quite lived up to its potential with Network Rail was the market-led proposals as a way of sort of driving further private sector involvement. So that's certainly something I think under a guiding mind you could resurrect schemes of that kind to try and involve the private sector more in infrastructure delivery.
We're working on a piece where we're looking at comparable operating models across 4 European countries, but also Japan. So it's work in progress, but I'm very happy to share that with you once complete, which might go some way to answering the question around different investment models.
We've heard in Japan that, sort of, because we've seen there that in many cases, it's the standard that a third of the investment in infrastructure will be from the private sector.
Yeah, so we're very happy to share that with you once complete. It won't be long.
Okay.
If I might come in, I think one of the reasons why we are so, repetitive, arguably, about the need to have certainty for investors is that in the freight sector there's a huge amount of inward investment coming in, not onto the core track, but in the terminals and the rolling stock. If you look at facilities like strategic rail freight interchanges, they're £1 billion investments, and that's, institutional investment coming in often from America, Canada and elsewhere. And for those businesses to bring their money to the UK, they need the certainty that the rail network is going to be there to deliver for them when they've made those investments. So actually having the right frameworks, having that certainty in place is bringing that private investment into the UK.
Thank you.
I'd like to conclude the session with just a few quick questions on the proposed role of the ORR. And I think you were all present for the first panel. Firstly, do any of you have concerns about the proposed changes to the ORR's competition duty and what that might mean for applications from both passenger and freight to progress? Steve, perhaps first.
Yeah, we do have concerns that we believe that the ORR, in the way that it's stipulated within the bill, its powers could be diluted. We think we need a strong ORR to make sure that it is acting as an independent body. Obviously, clearly, particularly if the IRB is going to look after the majority of the industry, how do you protect freight and open access and everybody else that sits outside that? So we believe that the powers need to be kept for the ORR, and they need to be kept at a high enough level that they have that independence and be able to act and challenge the IRB.
Maggie, do you share those?
I agree. I think we need a stronger regulation, in fact. So we shouldn't be watering down powers. We should be strengthening them.
Thank you. Andy?
No, absolutely. We've been consistently clear that we don't support that change. We did think it was slightly disingenuous in the initial consultation to talk about widening a competition duty, the implication being widening as strengthening. We very much see it as widening as diluting that competition duty. You heard John Larkinson say they've already duties to consider Secretary of State's funds. This is duplicative and will make it harder for future open access applications. And of course, the current government has expressed a desire to see more open access. As I say, I agree with John Larkinson that this will make it harder.
Okay, thank you. Jacqueline, anything to add?
I personally agree, but I must declare it's not an area that we sought input from our members.
Okay. And again, on similar question on the proposed changes to the access duty. Is it the same point you've just alluded to, or is there anything additional?
Same for us.
Okay, thank you.
I think the key point is that to have regard, it sort of reverses the normal relationship between the regulator and the regulated body, where in effect the regulated body is setting the access policy that the regulator would then have to have regard to. The key is, what does the access and use policy say? It's another missing piece of the jigsaw, and it's hard to know. I think we sort of touched on this, Maggie touched on this, one of her arguments, we sort of have to assume the kind of worst in some of these things until you get clarity on seeing what does the licence look like, the target operating model for the sector, and the access and use policy.
Thank you. And last question on the ORR. We touched on the removal of the Competition and Markets Authority. as a route available to them, where operators feel that they've been disadvantaged by unilateral changes made under the licence. Is that a concern to any of you?
Yeah, again, we would say that we believe that you should keep the CMA powers, or the ability to appeal against decisions, and watering that down as well, we think would be a disadvantage.
Yeah. Any additional points?
I agree with that.
Right. Thank you very much. That brings me to the end of our questions. As I did with the first panel, just give each of you an opportunity. Is there any additional points that you would like to put on record that we haven't covered in the session?
Not for me,
no.
Thank you.
Lovely. Now, thank you all once again for your time this morning. It's been very helpful indeed. Thank you. Order, order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.